Content warning. This episode discusses the topic of visualizing data related to sexual violence. If you've been affected and need help, get help. Visit the Where Can You Learn More section of this episode's project. Welcome to Explore, Explain, Highlights. In this highlights package, we'll be looking at Season 3, Episode 7, with our guests Mick and Munirah Mansoor, discussing the project Sexual Violence in Singapore, a Crisis.
Can you just give us a bit of background to sort of where the Kontinentalist came from and when you joined and what the purpose is of the organisation?
Sure. So I think in terms of the origins of the data of the studio, I guess, it wasn't, founded to do data visualization at the very start. The origins were much more purpose-driven in the sense that the founders wanted to kind of so-called bring Asia to the forefront of global conversations. The feeling was that there was a lot of richness and diversity in information, in history, and culture, of course, in the region that wasn't really maybe comprehensively and fairly represented in the global media landscape. So it was founded more for that purpose. And it was more, I think a year or two in that, the founders became aware of data visualization and data storytelling as a field. So perhaps it's a bit different from some of the founding stories of other data viz practitioners you might be interviewing, in the sense that that broader purpose came first, and then data visualization as the chosen means came later. And in terms of what it is now, I think as you briefly alluded to, it's a data visualization and storytelling studio, physically based in Singapore, but we actually have a lot of collaborators and colleagues who are all over the world. But what's important is that the data stories come from a so-called Asian angle, or talk about topics pertinent to the region. So in short, that's kind of what we do now. The other thing was that the thing about the trickle of headlines is that these cases, they are being reported on in terms of public newspapers. The issue, though, is not through anyone's fault or intent really, but likely due to, I guess, resourcing. A lot of the reporting of it is very kind of one-off, which is where you read every week, right? This person was assaulted, this was the age, the location, very scant on the details, and then you move on. And we felt quite strongly that the problem with that was, as a citizen, right? I get very limited information when I'm constantly flooded with bits and bits of information every week. So I don't get to see the overview of the pattern of what's happening. Who are the most vulnerable victims? Are there any common causes? Why isn't this being addressed, right? To identify effective ways of addressing a problem, you first need to identify the problem with absolute clarity. And we felt that was missing. And the second thing, I guess, aside from the reporting pattern, was because of this lack of, I think, a history of sophisticated public open discussion about this issue. There are a lot of, I guess we would call it rape myths, right? Or myths about what leads to sexual violence that's still very, very, very prevalent in Singapore. Anecdotally, a lot of us have friends, family, we grew up in schools where these ideas were normalized, but also I guess it informs policy, right? Because people in government come from society too. So common rape myths, for example, would be that you're likely to be assaulted by strangers. And so that extends into very well-meaning reproaches, right? Which is, oh, don't dress like that. Don't make sure you're not out alone. Avoid these places at night, which it seems kind of common sense, intuitive. You kind of see where it's coming from. But when you actually look at what's happening, you realize, hey, actually, no, most violence and assaulters are not complete strangers. They're people you know, right? And this looking at empirically what's actually there as facts with the data helped us to poke holes at these myths because they affect things like your policy responses, your reporting channels.
But from a mechanical process point of view, how did you narrow down the focus? I mean, are we talking about workshops? Are we talking about Zoom chats? Are we talking about storyboarding? How does it move from that initial conversation to something that you can at least start to get your teeth into a data set and a visual project?
That's a great question. I think at the very beginnings, there are a lot of kind of calls. It's an iterative process, as most of our creative processes are. I think I would describe it as we kind of get on board together, the internal and the external team, talk about ideas and the possible angles, and then we break away and do our research, right? So I think you first need to do some degree of research to see if there's any legs to stand on, so to speak. And we just kept doing that. We're like, actually, this seems a bit broad. I think at the last cut before we got to the final outline, right, it was it was actually going to look at like sexual violence and harassment across Southeast Asia. But then we realized, oh my gosh, that is going to be way too broad, way too ambitious for one data story. It's an important conversation to be had, but to kind of give the appropriate treatment for this topic, we decided to just go in depth for one country, the one that we knew best, both the external and the internal team. So I think that was a good call in retrospect. And that's how we moved slowly from that broad idea to the narrow idea through a lot of research and discussion.
I guess one of the main visas that actually inspired us the most was actually the Rape in India data story, which has a very striking animated Sankey vis at the end, which has this flowing red dots flowing over to the right side of the page. And we thought that it's such an impactful visualization in the sense that people will definitely know what's the topic about just by a single glance of it. Yeah, so we thought that kind of mood or a vibe is really suitable for the kind of topic that we're covering, which is on sexual assault in Singapore. And definitely my input would be to soften the triggers that readers who might feel when they read through the story. So basically just to make sure that people have the empathy and also to better bolster their feelings in case that it kind of triggers up some emotion. Maybe they can relate to the data itself. So
I think I think the visual excellence of the piece was in trying to find something iconic and evocative, but still sensitive and kind and gentle for a topic that is very painful for a lot of people, right? Because one of the very points of the piece is that actually sexual violence is all around us. And so we didn't want to make it so striking as if it's some different thing, but actually it's quite mundane. It's in our everyday basis, in our everyday relationships. So we wanted to have that kind of kindness and compassion in the visual mood as well. So yeah, the rape in India Sankey viz was one of the key data viz inspirations. And then in terms of what we avoided would be any sensationalist or overly striking or graphic, I guess, imagery or wording. But yeah, do you also want to talk about the HDB thing?
Oh yeah, I guess if you guys are not sure, but in Singapore, one of our national landscape is of course the HDB blocks, which are like apartments which the common Singaporeans live in. So, the HDB blocks itself lends a very mundane feel to it, that it's all similar in, its shape and the sizing and whatnot. So, yeah, I guess we sort of applied that mundane concept into like the sexual assault story. And if you notice that the cover itself looks like blocks sitting side by side, and that was kind of mundane feel that we tried to emphasize on in the story itself.
Interesting. Go ahead, Mick.
Like the facade of the public housing, I guess, is a repeated motif in the cover image, and I guess the tree map visualization as well. I think, as Munirah was mentioning, this public housing is ubiquitous, right? It's familiar to anyone who has been raised here. 80% of us live in these housing blocks. And so we thought that for, especially, I guess, a more local audience, it would have that, it'll hold
Relatability,
rich
yeah.
significance, right? That we're
Yeah,
telling you
that
that
domestic sense. Yeah.
yes, it's a national crisis,
Mm.
right? That we should all be familiar with.
Mm. I personally feel that I have a pretty unique milestone in the sense that I didn't even know DataVis existed, and it was a
Right.
yeah, so I came from a very traditional graphic design background where I deal with a lot of like print design, maybe a bit of digital design, a little bit of website design, but not exactly like information design on this level. So I guess the transition from graphic into database design isn't exactly different because a lot of the concepts and the theories that
Yeah.
I take design is actually applicable to information design and database design. And where I was from, it's a lot of like understanding the hierarchies in terms of the colors, the typography, and understanding what's the intuition and the emotion you want your readers to feel. And that's really applicable to database design in the end.
Thank you for joining us for this Explore, Explain Highlights episode. As always, the full episode is available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. We hope to see you again soon on another episode of Explore, Explain.